I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Ukraine crisis. I welcome Professor Stephen F. Cohen of New York University and Princeton University, Russian history emeritus, to comment on what we know right now about these days' events in Kiev, in Donetsk Oblast, that's eastern Ukraine, also in Odessa. We can touch upon that city tonight. It's on the Black Sea. I begin, however, with the events of the day. Stephen F. Cohen is the author of Cold War Again, Who's Responsible? You can find it in at thenation.com and The Nation magazine. At that point, when Steve writes and proposes, the question of Cold War, new Cold War, was in abeyance. But it's here. I believe, Steve, over the last week, we can say that everyone now acknowledges that the relationship between Washington and Moscow is as bad as it can be, given that we've been in apparent peace mode for the last 20 years. A very good evening to you. I begin with the Vice President's visit to Kiev in these last hours, saying that the United States supports the interim government in Kiev. Also, the reports from eastern Ukraine, very dire, of the discovery of bodies. There are different reports here. One report says that a politician and another man were found dead, evidence of torture, and that led the interim president, Mr. Turchinov, to say that this was the product of bandits, of rebels, of terrorists in eastern Ukraine. In eastern Ukraine, there are voices, loud voices, calling themselves federalists, also calling themselves pro-Russian forces, who are saying that there are bodies discovered that are the product of bandits or guerrillas or shooters from western Ukraine. So if we do not have a civil war, we have evidence of both sides using angry civil war-like words. I begin, Steve, with my first question. The Vice President's visit to Kiev today, do you believe that that helped the situation on the ground in Ukraine? Good evening to you.
John, it probably didn't help and it probably didn't hurt. It was empty symbolism by the Obama administration. And that statement by the Obama administration probably needs to be understood in the context of the front page story in the New York Times just this past Sunday. According to the New York Times reporter Peter Baker, he didn't name his sources, but it was on the front page of the Times, and the White House has not challenged the story. According to Baker, President Obama has decided to, quote, give up on Russian President Putin, to write him off as a negotiating partner, to wait for some future Russian leadership, and meanwhile, to revert to the policy that used to be known as containment. Well, containment was the Cold War policy. So officially, I suppose, if Baker's account is correct, we are now, according to the White House, in either a new or renewed Cold War. So we don't have to speculate about the possibility. What we need to think about is whether it might be worse than Cold War. In this context, you mentioned all these episodes in Ukraine, or mainly in the east, but there's a lot going on in Kiev in the west that's not good, that's not being reported. These are probably adumbrations, prefiguring omens of civil war. So the first danger is, will the new Cold War between East and West, which focuses on Ukraine, result in or include a civil war in Ukraine? If the answer is yes, probably, or maybe, would that bring Russian forces across the eastern border of Ukraine into Ukraine, and would it bring NATO forces into western Ukraine across the Polish border? And the latter possibility, we probably need to add one other thing that happened today. The announcement that NATO troops will be moving into, closer to Russia, Eastern Europe, and including, and it's an odd number, approximately 100 paratroopers in each of 4 or 5 East European countries. I'm not sure what the significance of the fact that they're paratroopers, but symbolically, I would say that the decision to dispatch any number of American troops to Eastern Europe right now is far more important than Biden's 14-hour visit to Kiev.
The Secretary of State, this is the London reporting tonight, Secretary of State John Kerry called Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to express deep concern. The quote is diplomatic, but I'll read nonetheless. Mr. Kerry, quote, expressed deep concern over the lack of positive Russian steps to de-escalate, citing mounting evidence that separatists continue to increase the number of buildings under occupation and take journalists and other civilians captive. The Secretary of State is referring to the late report today that two journalists, not just one, two journalists are now being held by someone in the East Ukraine. This points, Steve, to the failure of the negotiation last Thursday to take hold. The Secretary of State is pointing to that, asking Russia to tone down escalatory rhetoric, engage diplomatically in the East, and the Ukrainian government issue public statements calling for those occupying the buildings to disarm. As I understand it, Steve, the disarming was to be on both sides, and that is what both sides are using as as the explanation for why nothing's happened.
That's absolutely correct, and the second part of your statement is also absolutely correct. Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, is arguing that Kiev, the government, the official government of Ukraine, has done nothing to deoccupy the buildings that were taken in January and February in Kiev, to disarm armed militia that support the government that have formed in Kiev and in western Ukraine, and that this process of seizing buildings, government buildings, has been going on in western Ukraine, to which no one pays any attention except the Russians. That's the part of Ukraine that's supposed to be pro-European, that plenty of government buildings remain occupied in western Ukraine, and that occupation is enforced by armed bands or militias that Kiev does nothing about. Now, that raises a question. In Geneva last week, all sides agreed that all armed militia, unofficial ones, should be disarmed. The question is the assumption under the premise, and the premise, I think, is pernicious because it's terribly false. Let's assume that Russia is involved covertly to some degree in the unrest in eastern Ukraine, that they're doing things there to abet that. But that doesn't mean that Russia controls everything that's happened in eastern Ukraine. That would be preposterous. It would be a contempt for the people of eastern Ukraine who have legitimate grievances. Just like it was preposterous to say that the United States was controlling all the demonstrators in Kiev in January and February, or Europe was. The United States in Europe had people there. Senator McCain was there. Excuse me, John. Just last Sunday, or was it 2 Sundays ago, the director of the CIA was in Kiev.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that Senator McCain or the director of the CIA is controlling everything that's going on in western Ukraine. And I assure you, Putin is not. Now, what he wants, whether he wants that tamped down in eastern Ukraine or not, I don't know. But when you begin a negotiation, when both sides agree to disarm and deoccupy these events in east and west Ukraine, it's going to fail because they cannot do it. And that takes us back to your question, are we headed towards civil war? The tail, I've come back to this several times, the tail is wagging the dog being civil war and east-west war, the possibility. And the tail takes many forms, as you know. Tough guys running around in black masks in east and west Ukraine. Armed gangs, militia, in west and east Ukraine. Bodies showing up in the rivers. Snipers shooting people as provocations. Mysterious leaflets claiming there's going to be a Jewish pogrom. Clearly a fake, but who faked it? To what purpose? You've got all these incendiary tails, to mix my metaphors, wagging the dog of war, and that's why the developments of this week and today make things even worse. But that agreement in Geneva is something to return to because it's the only statement of mutual principle or aspiration that all the sides have signed on to, and it's not a bad set of principles.
When we come back, we're going to get to solutions tonight, or at least the possibility of solutions, whether there can be, because there's reporting in London now of funerals being held for men. One, Sergei Rudenko, 57 years old, who's said to have been shot in a checkpoint shootout just on Easter Sunday, in Ukraine, near the village of Slavyansk. But we need to speak to the larger European picture before we can go to solutions for Ukraine, and that has to do with NATO and the anxiety in NATO and the NATO countries, the 28 NATO countries led by the United States, of course. Professor Stephen F. Cohen of New York University and Princeton Universities. Steve is the author most recently of The New Cold War, Cold War Again, Who's Responsible? That's at thenation.com. He's also the author of Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, From Stalinism to the New Cold War. Steve wrote this book a few years back. He anticipated perfectly. I'm John Batchelor. I'm John Batchelor. Professor Stephen F. Cohen of New York University and Princeton University, Russian History Emeritus, is here with me, and we're discussing Ukraine crisis. We turn now to the larger story of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, 65 years old just now, reaching its seniority and perhaps its pass-sell date. The announcement from the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, is that 600 U.S. troops from the 173rd Airborne Brigade, based in Italy, will now be dispatched but distributed as if they're dealing cards throughout the front line of NATO against the Russian Federation. 150 soldiers will go to Poland on Wednesday to conduct what are called infantry exercises. 150 to Estonia, to Latvia, Lithuania. Those are the three Baltic states. We've heretofore heard that there are more Air Force personnel being forward-based in Romania, where there's an air base, and there has been a U.S. warship operating in the Black Sea, Donald Cook. I can't say if it's there now. Steve, even NATO is acknowledging that this is a slight movement of deployment in the event that there's trouble in Ukraine. Does this end the concern about NATO launching a military force into Russia? With 450 paratroopers, you can't say that anybody's serious about combating whatever goes on in Ukraine.
No, but let's just be sure what at least I'm talking about. It's not whether NATO troops would enter Russia. It's whether they would enter Western Ukraine, provoking Putin to enter Eastern Ukraine. I don't think there's any discussion anywhere, I wouldn't think, about invading Russia. It's a strange story that you just reported, John. You also said that NATO is 65 years old.
Right.
It means it just qualified for Medicare.
That's right.
Which means maybe now it'll get a subsidy from the government and be able to send more men. What's the significance of these paratroopers? So here's what came out of Washington last week and continued this week. The Polish foreign minister was in Washington, I believe. And when he left the White House or wherever he was, he said he had an agreement that something that Poland has been asking for a long time, that there would be forward-based NATO troops, including American troops, in Poland. He mentioned a figure, I think, of around 10 to 15,000.
That's right. He asked for 2 armored brigades. Yeah. Yes.
Now, remember that they're talking a kind of Delphic language here. Does 175 paratroopers, Americans, mean that they'll be supplemented by 750 NATO paratroopers? I mean, is that just the American contribution? Because America's part of NATO, and what one does, they're all supposed to do. But what's the real meaning of this? I guess it is twofold. Remember what happened since we began to expand NATO. We took in these countries, but we had an agreement with Russia that we wouldn't base their forward-based troops in these new NATO countries. And we pretty much honored that agreement. And so in the new NATO countries, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, the Baltic, and the rest, there are no significant NATO troops. But what we did do is we built the infrastructure for a larger detachment, airstrips, barracks, maybe some missile defense installations, the kinds of things that would be ready if we needed it. So what the proposal has been during the last 2 weeks, coming from the high command of NATO and from some U.S. senators, now's the time to move NATO forces into those 5 or 6 countries toward Russia. I assume that this announcement that a handful, it's more than a handful, but 100 or so American paratroopers are going to be sent to 4 or 5 of those countries is meant to either be the first wave of that NATO movement into Eastern Europe, or it's meant to be a symbolic warning to Russia that if you do any more, we'll really come in this direction with a mass force. But I think all it is, John, if we really are at a moment where there are 2 ways to go forward. One is to militarize the crisis even more, and the other is to politicize it, that is, turn it to diplomacy. Then the militarized variant is escalating and has the upper hand at this moment, and the Russians haven't moved any troops. So we have to say that NATO and Washington are currently doing the escalation, though it's still only symbolic.
The puzzle, and we'll turn to solutions in Ukraine in just a moment, but the puzzle for me, my memory of Cold War, is that any troop deployment whatsoever, always at the same time, there was a back-channel negotiation underway, Steve.
Yep.
That's how the real Cold War worked. I don't hear anything like that now.
And you've pointed to such an important thing, as you often do, John, and it helps to know history, as you do, because so much of the media today is lacking in any historical context. When you look back on the old 45-year Cold War, after Stalin died in 1953, it was dangerous, but it was fairly stable, with the exception of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Khrushchev crossed a red line, and maybe even without knowing it. And one reason it was stable, all this secret communication was going on. You remember the legendary tales of the Soviet ambassador in Washington, Dobrynin, who was always the first person the president called when there was any hint of a crisis. He was considered a back channel and a reliable one, and information was good. And then at some point they put in the hotline. You remember that?
Yes.
The whole idea is the Cold War is dangerous, and we need rules of conduct. And the fact that we survived 45 years of Cold War, even though we had an arms race, and we had a few near brushes and some secret history we don't know, was because of this secret infrastructure of stability and negotiation and communication. What you've just suggested, I think, is right and ominous. That doesn't exist anymore, partly because there's been all this American denial for 20 years as the Cold War was unfolding, the new one, the Cold War was impossible. So no precautions were taken. Now we're in a profound Cold War crisis that could turn hot, and we're told that Obama doesn't even want to talk to Putin anymore. And the body language between Lavrov and Kerry, the foreign ministers, has seemed pretty good, but they seem out of touch with each other now. And now we're living in a sea of misinformation coming from all parts and troops on the move. It's very bad. And what you say is missing. These fail-safe devices, diplomatic communication, make it all the worse.
And we will turn to Ukraine next, but I want to make it sure everybody understands, because this is just up at USA Today, 9 p.m. East Coast time. 150 soldiers to Poland, 150 soldiers, 173rd Airborne Brigade to Estonia, 150 soldiers to Latvia, 150 soldiers to Lithuania, the Baltic states, in addition to Poland. Front line of NATO. I'm John Batchelor. We'll be back with Steve Cohen. Professor Stephen F. Cohen the author of Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, From Stalinism to the New Cold War, a prescient volume of several years past about the tragedy of the 20th century, the Gulag, and the fate of people who were crushed by the Soviet Union. Here we are in the 21st century. Soviets are gone. The Russian Federation, a 120 million very proud people with a 1,000-year history in Eurasia. The contest here is difficult to define, but we will keep to Ukraine right now. The headlines from Itar TASS, this is out of Moscow this morning, Foreign Minister Lavrov urges Kiev to comply with the Geneva Agreement, meaning cancel the orders to use the army against your own population. Turchinov, the interim president, is dispatching more counterterrorism fighters, he calls them, to eastern Ukraine. Russia is expelling the first secretary of the Canadian embassy in 2 weeks in retaliation for the expulsion of a Russian official from Canada. And this choice item, the poison between former borders. Russia may ban fruit and vegetable imports from Poland. Poland has a wonderful agriculture. The fruit and the food there is magnificent. Banning that fruit and vegetable is a blow to everyone along the frontier. Poland depends upon Russian imports. But, Steve, I come to my reporting today, and I'll speak later on tonight to Anna Nemtsova of the Daily Beast. She was in Odessa, a large, important city on the Black Sea, part of Ukraine, as well as to Jamie Detmer of the Voice of America and the Daily Beast. He was in Donetsk, and both told me that many Russian speakers are looking for the May 11th referendum, not the May 25th, 26th, 27th presidential election. Mr. Biden today gave American money to support that election later in the month for a president of Ukraine to replace Yanukovych. There are several major candidates. But the referendum on May 11th, no one knows how it'll be run. No one knows who'll pay for it. No one knows that it'll be, in fact, possible given the threats to eastern Ukraine. And that vote is said to be for the people of eastern Ukraine, which significantly Mr. Putin and others in Moscow call Novorossiya. That is a vote for federalism in Ukraine as compared to the central government of Kiev. Is that the beginning of a solution, Steve, for the people of Ukraine or for people of eastern Ukraine and Odessa to vote for federalism?
I think it is the solution, but let's put it in context. Let's go back to last week when Ukraine, Russia, the United States, and Europe met in Geneva and agreed essentially, sort of, to endorse Russian proposals for negotiation that were issued on March 17th. Here were the components of what they agreed on. That all the armed militia should be disarmed, in East and West. We talked about that tonight earlier, and that's hard to implement, and it hasn't happened. Secondly, that Ukraine is really several countries trying to live under one state for historical reasons, and therefore the only way you could maintain a single territorial Ukraine is by having a federal constitution, not a unitary. For example, under the current Ukrainian constitution, all the governors of the regions in the east and in the west are appointed by the Kiev government. There's no local electoral autonomy at all. The argument is that has to change. So the local regions, like American states, would have more representation. Third, you need new elections. There's going to be a presidential election, maybe, on May 25, but the Russians are arguing you've got to have parliamentary elections too, because the current parliament, which is the government, doesn't represent eastern Ukraine. Then the result has to be a neutral government. That means a Ukraine that will not now or ever join NATO, and a Ukraine that can have trade relations with Europe, but must also have trade relations with Russia. So those are the proposals. The key proposal, because elections are implementation, are twofold. The end of NATO expansion, that can be decided in Washington one way or another. So it comes down to this idea of a federal constitution for Ukraine. Now, we, the United States, fought a civil war to enact, maintain, and implement our federal constitution, and we've been fighting about states' rights, usually through the Supreme Court, ever since. It's not an easy concept of government, but Germany has one. They've been stable. Canada has one. They've had some problems. Federalism is used in many parts of the world where you have a country made up of disparate people, ethnicities, people with different histories. The problem here is the Russians are clearly pushing for something that is more like confederation. That is, where the central government in Kiev would have very little power, and most of the power would be in the regions. And that would enable Russia to conduct its own foreign and economic policy with eastern Ukraine. That would not be a good outcome because you wouldn't end up with one Ukraine. It's got to be more federal than confederal, but that's a negotiating point. Kiev, the current government, is arguing against any kind of federalism. It's simply saying that it's prepared to decentralize some power, but that a government, a decision made by a parliament or a leadership, can be undone by the next one. That's why the general view is this has to be a constitution that everybody agrees to live by. I think it can be done. It's been done in other countries, and it takes time. Above all, it takes a mutual will to do it. The Russians seem ready. Kiev is against it. Washington doesn't seem to be able to make up its mind. I would guess that in Europe, people like Merkel, think about Germany. Think about how important the different regions of Germany are. They have their own elections, their own parliaments, and yet Germany is a unified state. She would clearly understand this idea of federalism for Ukraine, and I am sure that privately she is backing it. Federalism is an idea known very well to Europeans, and if Americans think about it, to us too. But it can be abused, so it comes down to goodwill, serious negotiations. But the only alternative is a Ukrainian civil war. And the horrors that would unleash in Europe, and that it might lead to an American-Russian war, don't even make that worth thinking about, just avoiding.
I want to mention the Peter Baker piece you cited as we started talking tonight. Peter Baker is a measured and very careful reporter for the New York Times. So when he writes about the thinking behind the scenes in the White House without naming names, it has authority. These are the thoughts of the president and his immediate counsel. In that piece, not only mentioned how Mr. Obama no longer believed that he could establish or work with Mr. Putin, it mentioned that the Obama administration was going to treat Russia as a pariah state. Pariah state, that word was used in the article.
That's right.
The puzzle here, Steve, is how do you go forward with these ideas that you advance, that you say from Geneva, with the United States treating the other side as pariah state? That's a way of saying that people have no dignity, they're not worthwhile, they're wicked. It's a way of treating pariah state. That would be Syria. So it sounds to me like the conversation has already been poisoned from Washington's point of view. Therefore, the idea of cobbling together a constitution, and the original agreement called for transparent, accountable constitution, seems science fiction, Steve.
I don't know to whom Obama listens regarding this crisis, but he has not had good advisors on Russia since he became president. There's no sign that he, unlike, for example, Ronald Reagan, when Gorbachev came to power, is reaching outside his official advisors. I don't feel comfortable mentioning names, but I know that he's declined to see one or two of America's most eminent statesmen who have no political ambition, but have enormously wise and experienced thoughts on this, that he doesn't want to meet with them. Also, that article reported, John, that Obama doesn't want to talk about Russia unless he's forced to.
Right.
And that's astonishing. Let me tell you, the first time I really felt anger rather than cool detachment, which I prefer. I don't remember in my lifetime, ever, in the United States, such a historic policy being made, if Baker is right, that Obama's decided it's Cold War now, a new one. And what all that's going to mean for ourselves and our kids and possibly our grandchildren. And it's going to be in a new arms race. We haven't talked about that, but Putin spoke about that in a very interesting way the other day, the new arms race. That this has ever happened without some kind of public debate about it in the mainstream media. So far as I can tell, John, the only national broadcast that has any kind of debate about this at all is the John Batchelor Show. You don't find it on ABC, NBC, their channel affiliates, their cables, stations, their national, but you don't find it in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. It is one hand, the hand of war, clapping, and I just can't imagine Even when we went to war in Iraq, we had a few months of debate about it. One side lost, but there was a debate. Democracy was functioning. There is no democracy now, and there is not one, so far as I know, one maybe, elected representative, national representative of either political party, Democrat or Republican, who has said to the Obama administration, as it declares Russia a pariah state, declares a new Cold War, embraces containment, which means an arms race, not one elected official who said, hold on a minute, could we please discuss this first? Not one. It is a spineless political class or an ignorant one. And this country deserves a real political class. And I mean, even in Russia, Putin's being challenged. Do you understand this? In Russia, Putin is being challenged in newspapers. He was even challenged in his own press conference the other day about the wisdom of his policy. There is not a word of reproach or query or criticism to the Obama administration about the way it's conducted its Russia policy. This is a defeat for democracy in America, a crushing defeat. And I don't understand how these people are going to explain themselves to history if any of us are still around.
I want to go to one place, an elected government, where there is debate about this. There are different opinions, and there is an understanding of the threat, and that's Berlin. I mentioned, and when we come back, we'll speak of this at length, is Frank-Walter Steinmeier, the foreign minister of Germany, said on Sunday, I think he talked to one of the major German newspapers, that he believes there must be consideration for not more sanctions, but for a normalization of relations between Moscow and the West. And he's looking at the idea that they can't do without Russian energy. That is not realistic in Germany. So I think he, Steinmeier, and Mrs. Merkel are looking very carefully as elected officials at the future, Steve. I don't think they're rushing into treating Russia as a pariah state. We'll turn to Germany with Professor Stephen F. Cohen, Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, and his article at thenation.com, the Cold War again, who's responsible, at thenation.com. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. I'm John Batchelor. Professor Stephen F. Cohen, New York University and Princeton University, Russian History Emeritus, is here with me. Steve is the author of The New Cold War, Who's Responsible, at thenation.com, as well as Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives from Stalinism to the New Cold War, a book of several years past in which Steve identified the trend that was unhappy at the time but now is upon us, of a breakdown in relations between Moscow and Washington that describes a Cold War. Escalation, militarization, threats, misunderstanding. Steve, within the last days, German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier, in a comment to Bild am Sonntag, this is a very large newspaper on Sunday, on Easter in Germany, quoted, "I sometimes wish that the same engagement being used for the debate about sanctions against Russia would also exist when it comes to avoiding a further escalation." He went on to say, "We've already exhaustively discussed the sanctions issue." He pointed to the fact that we believe that normalization needs as much attention as sanctions. This was said to be in response to the German defense minister who is calling for increased sanctions. The background for all of this, if I understand it, is that the European Union does not welcome sanctions because it concerns itself about counter-sanctions to do with energy, and that there is no workaround for Russian energy. Europe needs it. It could develop other resources, but it will take many years. And forcing this issue right now is a threat to the European economy. Are these measured voices that we need to listen to, Steve, as opposed to those who have gone mute and turned their back on Moscow and Washington?
Well, yes, but I mean, let's do a little irony here. All these years after World War II, and I hope this doesn't sound like a rant, because I don't like to rant, but I'm so angry about the silence of the American political class that in this regard, Germany has more democracy than America does today. They're having a debate about what to do about this crisis with Russia. Now, that said, Germany occupies a very special position. It did during the Cold War. There was a divided Berlin, there was a divided Germany, and there was a divided opinion in Western Germany. There was the so-called East policy, the opening to the East, where Germany was really among the first to pursue a policy of détente with Russia. It pioneered what America, with the Soviet Union, what America then followed. Now you have a different situation, as you pointed out. Germany gets, the number varies, but it gets about 35% of its energy from Russia. And there's talk about replacing that, but it couldn't be done for a decade or more, and it would be enormously expensive. And there are a lot of question marks over that. So they're worried about energy, that if Russia decided that it was going to cut back on its energy, Germany would, there's this old political science adage, people stand politically where they sit, and Germany sits on Russian energy. The lights will go out. Winter will come again. Factory prices will go up for goods that are from factories that are burning Russian energy, and all the rest. And yet there's another point of view in Germany, that Russia must be punished, that Russia's broken the rules, that Russia has behaved so badly that if what it did in Crimea or wherever stands, Europe itself will be without rules and will be vulnerable. But you're seeing a real debate, and it's not just driven by Germany's economic dependency on Russia, which is true. And it's not only gas, it's markets, it's other minerals that Russia provides to German industries. But it's 2 points of view in Germany. They go way back in history about how to relate to Russia. One point of view sees Russia as part of Europe. Arbitrary, capricious, weirdly behaved sometime, but a cousin, not a pariah, to use the expression that's coming out of the White House. It's not a pariah. It's a wayward brother, a wayward son, a wayward relative. And you work these things out. And that's what you're hearing on one side. And on the other side, you're hearing the kind of Brussels, Washington, NATO point of view that Russia must be punished, and punished severely. Remember that three, and I know you should never name a number on the radio or TV because you're going to forget the third, but three former German chancellors, Kohl, Schroeder, and give me the name of the one before Schroeder, and that's him, have criticized European policy toward Ukraine, essentially blaming Europe for triggering this crisis. So this debate in Germany is not only on the television, not only among voters, not only on the radio, not only in the newspapers, but at the very highest levels of the political establishment. That's the way it should be. We don't have that in the United States. And so the answer is, if we could listen to the German debate, we should. But here in America, we don't listen to anybody but ourselves. I mean, nobody listens to Putin. Putin gave a fantastically interesting 4-hour press conference last week. He said many things that were never reported here. He was criticized from the floor by his own appointees. That's never reported. It's just some Putin that we preconceived who's reported. We don't listen.
I recall, just in a moment, Steve, a conversation that you and I had right after Mr. Obama's embassy to Moscow in the summer of 2009, his first year in the presidency, when he met with Medvedev, then the president, and the prime minister, then Vladimir Putin.
Correct.
And afterwards, because there were cold stares during that meeting, I reported to you that immediately Medvedev went to Berlin to sit down with Mrs. Merkel, because what was underway was an alliance between Berlin and Moscow, an important development that you flagged at the time, and we often talked about it that summer and the year afterwards. Now, reflecting upon that, at the time it seemed like an economic advantage. Now it looks like that relationship is established, and that would be the basis for dialogue on Ukraine.
You're talking about Berlin, Moscow.
Yes.
Well, I'd put a question mark by that. What we discussed at the time, John, because how long we've been having...
We just have 30 seconds. We'll take this up next week. Go ahead, Steve.
But earlier, Moscow's two most important bilateral relationships were with Beijing and Berlin. Now we're seeing the relationship with Berlin tested. And we can't be sure how it's going to play out, but we're going to know more in the next couple of weeks, I think.
You said at the time, though, that was a significant development in the history of Europe. Moscow and Berlin, who had fought to destruction of the continent just 60 years before, and they were now in open conversation.
Yep. Embraced they were.
Professor Stephen F. Cohen, author of Soviet Fates and Lost